Alright guys, how's it going? Today I want to talk about a very exciting subject, math. But not the type of math that makes you solve for X. This is the good type of math. The type of math that makes you money. In particular, I want to talk about the growth rate of trees and why you should be extremely careful harvesting younger timber. And to demonstrate why you should be cautious, I'm sitting on 3 logs that come from the same tree. I just harvested it. And we're going to be looking at the growth rates over the past few decades and what exactly they did. But first, just to talk about that, just to recap so we're all on the same page, let's review exactly how trees grow and how area and volume work for circular objects. So the first thing to remember that's kind of a fundamental concept in forestry is the sigmoid curve. This is the line that represents how trees grow over time. At the beginning of their lives, trees grow very slowly and put on a small amount of volume. As they get older, they start to put on more and more volume and the growth rate increases. As they reach maturity, their growth rate once again slows down until they die. The other formula to remember is pi r squared. Now that's the formula for the area of a circle. Now the important part of that equation as it relates to trees is the r squared. As the radius of a tree increases, the area and by extension volume of that tree increases exponentially because it's squared. So just as a quick example, 2 times 2, 3 times 3, 4 times 4, it increases very rapidly as the radius increases. And that's why they call it exponentials, because it has an exponent. Clever, huh? Even if that radius increases by an ever smaller amount, it can still represent an exponential growth in the total volume, albeit at a slower rate. So before we take a look at these logs, those are the 2 things to really keep in mind. A young tree is going to grow fast, and that small rings around a large base are going to increase the volume by quite a bit. So having gone over those fundamental concepts, let's take a look at these 3 logs and see what it actually looks like in reality. So taking a look at the first log here, you can see the markings I've made. Now, each one of these lines is an increment of 10. So this is the first 10 years, this is 20, and this is 30. And then this last section is the last 7 years. So this is a 37-year-old tree. Now the first thing to note is in a previous video, I talked about how you can see this pattern in all the trees of having been released in the 1996 harvest, and this tree is no different. The first 10 years it was extremely suppressed. There's a little bit of rot in that suppression again, but it was extremely suppressed and it was barely growing for an entire decade. All of a sudden we had that harvest and its growth rate started to explode. So the first 10 years it was very suppressed and it was still just kind of a sapling, so you couldn't do anything with it. It wasn't merchantable. Skip ahead to 20 years and all of a sudden, that's about 6 inches at the base, you could have gotten a usable log out of it, probably a 10-foot log. And I did kind of scale these. I didn't do it perfectly, but this is just conceptual. I scaled them on the board foot scale, even though I'm selling these by the ton. And that one log represents about 5 board feet. So you could have cut the tree, sold it for 5 board feet, and have been done with it. Yay, moving on to the next tree. But what would have happened if we would have waited an additional 30 years? Well, between ages 20 and 30, the 5 board feet went to 30 board feet. Just waiting an additional 10 years would have given you 6 times more usable volume from that log. But in the words of Billy Mays, there's more. Here we have the second log of the tree. Now, here we have a similar effect, where at age 20, this is where it would have been. So, whereas you could have gotten a usable log from the first log at age 20, about half the tree would have been waste because you wouldn't have been able to get a log from the second half of the tree. Had you waited another 10 years, you could have gotten a log that was worth 15 board feet. But that's not all. This is the final log of the tree. This is the third log, and this was its diameter at age 20. It basically was just the top of a tree. Again, at age 30, you could have gotten an entirely new log out of it. Now that would have been a fairly small log, only 10 board feet, but you get the idea. So the total difference in board feet from age 20 to 30 was 50 board feet. At 20 years of age, you could have only gotten 5 board feet, just 1 usable log. At age 30, you got 55 board feet. But this tree is not 30 years old. This tree is 37 years old. So how much extra did we get from that last 7 years of its life. So, going back to the first log, this is age 30 right here, and this is obviously age 37, right before I cut it this last summer. Now, that only represents maybe an inch in radius, 2 inches in diameter, but that's a 50% increase in the total volume of this log. It went from 30 board feet to 45 board feet. For log 2, we only had maybe 1.5 inches of diameter growth, but that still represented a 25% increase in the volume. And for the last log, again, just a small increase, but we still went from 10 board feet to 15 board feet. So altogether, that last 7 years, that last 1/3 of the previous 20-year increment, gave us a 45% increase in the total yield. Clearly, it would have been a huge mistake to have harvested this when it was only 20 years old. While so many things in business and economics are governed by a law of diminishing returns, forestry, at least in terms of timescales, are more governed by a law of increasing returns. It really pays to wait sometimes. And the benefits go beyond just the yield of the logs. It's a lot easier to harvest this larger wood. Now, while there are a lot of variables in the cost of timber harvest, and a lot of the studies are either based on outdated figures or some weird assumptions, a good rule of thumb is that it costs approximately 50% less to harvest 10-inch logs over 5-inch logs. And then it costs an additional 25% less to harvest 20-inch logs over 10-inch logs. And that's because the amount of work involved in felling and processing one small tree is not that much less compared to harvesting a larger tree. And I experienced that firsthand. In the areas where I was kind of doing a thinning and cutting some of the smaller trees, it took me an extremely long amount of time, and I wasn't really getting that much yield out of it. On the other hand, when I was in areas where I was cutting larger trees, I was able to get much more yield in about the same amount of time. And that's simply because I'm getting more amount of wood for every notch I make. I'm getting more amount of wood for every wedge that I pound. I'm getting more amount of wood for every limb that I cut. There's more volume per movement when you're cutting larger trees. Now, in that instance, there is a little bit of a diminishing return because as trees get larger, it can be a little harder to handle it. You know, the limbing on larger trees does take a little bit longer. Heavier logs are harder on equipment, which increases your cost. There are things like that. So after about 20 inches in diameter, any sort of gain in productivity from gross volume is kind of counteracted by those additional costs. In any case, I would much rather be harvesting a stand of 15 to 20 inch wood rather than 5 inches. And I'm not sure if I've ever met a logger that would disagree with that statement. So the economics of tree growth aren't just about the volume of the log. At 20 years, yes, you could have gotten a single log out of the tree and gotten some money for it. But you probably would have been paying the logger a little more because it's harder to harvest that small wood. Waiting that additional 10 years and then that additional 7 years made the economics of that harvest and that tree growth much more viable, as you can see. But that doesn't mean you should never cut young timber. Of course, I cut this tree, and looking at this data, you might think I'm stupid. Maybe it would have been better to wait another 5, 7, 10 years, and maybe you'd be right. But the key feature that made me cut this tree was that first 10 years. Now, if you recall, the first 10 years of this tree life was spent in severe suppression. It wasn't able to grow because it was under a dense canopy of other trees. As soon as this tree was released, its growth rate started to explode. Now, as you can see all around me, there are some young fir trees in this area, and I didn't want that same thing to happen to them. Even if this tree was still growing at a fairly fast pace, it was going to hit that point in the sigmoid curve where its growth was going to start to diminish. And I didn't want it to be in that phase while also suppressing these young trees that haven't hit the exponential phase of that growth. So in my opinion, that's really when you should be cutting young timber, is when the growth of that timber is suppressing the growth of timber around it. And again, you know, this kind of exemplifies the purpose of this harvest and why I'm doing it this way. Fir is kind of a controversial species in Maine. There's kind of a joke among foresters. They say, when's the best time to cut fir? When you see it. And that is kind of an allusion to the fact that it blows over, it rots really easily, but it also grows extremely fast. And so if you're doing a delicate harvest, if you're approaching the stand with enough finesse, it can really, really pump out some growth and it's a real mistake to cut it before maturity. So that kind of sheds some light on some of my thought process behind this whole thing. Anyway, hopefully you found that interesting. I know I've kind of talked about these concepts before, but I thought there was no better way to really explain these concepts than when you have a tree cut up right in front of you. You can actually see that data and count those rings. So like I said, hopefully you learned something from this. Now I got to get back to cutting. This was just my break. Still have a lot more, still have a lot more wood to cut, unfortunately, or fortunately. So if you liked this, if you found it interesting, there's a lot more coming your way. We have a lot more cutting to do, a lot more forwarding, and then come next spring, I'm going to be doing another harvest. So like and subscribe for more, and I will see you later. Now, if you excuse me, I have some sawdust and pitch to get covered in.